guys see it behind me, a little red schoolhouse. One-room schoolhouses like this in the middle of the country are kind of an iconic scene in American history. Today we're going to learn a little bit about how they got here, why they're always in the same place, and how they're the last visible marks of American laws that predated the Constitution. So that's where we are. We're talking about the organizing of America, both physically, like we just talked about in the video, and in the idea of organizing a government for these new United States of America. So, the first set of laws that we passed during the Revolutionary War to organize this new country that doesn't even really exist except on paper during the fighting of the war, the first set of laws is not the Constitution, it's something Constitution-esque called the Articles of Confederation. Now, always remember, the Articles of Confederation are not the Confederacy. The Confederacy is something that happens in the 1860s that's real bad. The Articles of Confederation happened in the 1780s and are only medium bad. So, the thing to understand that we've talked about in here before, many of the new Americans did not see themselves as Americans. And if you ask Thomas Jefferson when he's in Paris in the 1780s, hey, TJ, what are you? He would have said, I'm a Virginian. He would not have said, I'm an American. Whereas if you or I today were in Paris and Frenchie comes up to us and says, what are you, my friend? And we would be like, I'm an American. We would not probably go, I'm an Ohioan. But that's the difference, right? We perceive our nation as the United States. In the very early days of the Republic, they perceived their nation as their state. So John Adams would have identified as a Massachusettsian. Thomas Jefferson would have identified as a Virginian, and so on and so forth. Everywhere else in the world, you kind of got to remember, state actually means country. Your state is your country in the rest of the world. We're the weird place where state means the subdivision of the country. So the way I always kind of think about the Articles of Confederation is that these are like when the Power Rangers come together to form Megazord, okay? Under the Articles of Confederation government, each colony was its own Power Ranger. Pennsylvania is Blue Ranger, Massachusetts is the Red Ranger, the Green Ranger is North Carolina, whatever. But then when there's a big emergency, they could all, form up into the Megazord, all right? So they're individual robots when the fights are normal, and then they come together in times of emergency to be the big robot. I hope that makes sense. I hope people still watch Power Rangers. Government under the Articles of Confederation. So it's kind of more of a joke, like what government? The central government of the United States had almost no power under the Articles of Confederation. There was no executive branch. There was no real president. There was no judicial branch to determine the winner of conflicts under the law. There was no national currency. This is one of my favorite things. There were New York dollars and Pennsylvania dollars and South Carolina dollars and Virginia dollars and Delaware dollars, and so on and so forth. And without a national currency, it's hard to actually have meaningful trade between the states based on currency. There was no power to enforce the laws. Since there was no executive branch, there was no ability to enforce the laws, and that's a problem if you're trying to have a country. There was no power to tax. Now, a lot of us, those of you with jobs who get taxes taken out of your check, are like, no power to tax sounds awesome. I hate paying my taxes. Well, guess what? You and everybody else, we all hate paying our taxes. But it's the cost of living in an organized society. Under the Articles of Confederation, yes, the government did not have the power to tax, which is kind of awesome, but it also meant the government doesn't have any money and the government can't do anything. So there was not any kind of meaningful national program. The government couldn't build national roads. They couldn't fund an army. They couldn't maintain a navy. There's a lot of downsides to not having any taxes whatsoever. Other problems politically. Laws did not require a 50% majority to pass. They required a 9 out of 13 vote. And that's a really hard bar to get to. If you guys remember, I talked in earlier classes, like, if I let you guys vote on what toppings we're going to get on pizza, it would be hard for me to get 50% of you to agree on what we're going to get on pizza, much less getting 9 out of 13 people to agree on what topping we're going to get on pizza. Even worse, what if I said, hey, pizza or B-dubs, but everybody has to agree? It's never going to happen. You're never going to get everybody to agree. You needed a 9 out of 13 vote to do anything, to pass any law. You needed a 13 out of 13 to amend. This was a terrible set of laws. And furthermore, every state had only one vote regardless of population. Try to imagine today if that was the case in the United States, where California with 40 million people had exactly as much a say in what happened in Washington as Wyoming does with 500,000 people. We all understand that is inherently unfair if you're even going to pretend to be a partial democracy. Now, you say to yourself, why did they do this? Why did they possibly think this was a good idea to completely incapacitate any kind of leadership? Why did they think it was a good idea to have a government that couldn't do anything? Well, the reason is they'd been there, they'd done that. They bought the t-shirt in the lobby afterwards. They had lived under England with George III as an exceptionally strong ruler, and they never ever wanted to do that again. So, meanwhile, they win the war, right? And as they are winning the war, now all those British rules start going out the window. So if you remember at the end of the French and Indian War, remember they drew that line that I said is really important down the middle of the Appalachian Mountains called the Proclamation Line that said no British settlers are allowed to go to the other side of the line. We're not going to have a repeat of the French and Indian War with George Washington and his merry band starting a war. So now that the British rule is gone, the Proclamation Line is gone. So lots of now American citizens say, well, guess what? I'm going over the hill. I'm going over the Proclamation Line, and I'm going to take some of that sweet, sweet hunting ground in the Ohio country or the place called Kentucky, the Cane Lands, Kentucky. They're going over the mountains to get to this new, what they believe will be really excellent farming land over in Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, etc. So now the government has a new problem. Not only does this national government that has no power have to try and come up with rules that work for the 13 colonies, now they have to figure out a way to administer land that doesn't belong to a state. Do you see the problem here? The government is based on state governments, but there are no state governments on the other side of the hills. So they got to figure out something to do. And what they come up with is what I talked about at the outset of this video. Land Ordinance of 1785. The Land Ordinance is, in my opinion, one of the great laws, great concepts in American history. And I love this graphic that I found online. I wish I could give credit for it right now, but I can't remember what site I took this from. The Land Ordinance surveys the land and breaks it into townships, which are 36 miles square. Now, you guys, we have townships around town, right? There's Jerusalem Township is where Oregon is if you're on the east side. If you're North Toledo, West Toledo, you know about Washington Township where Whitmer is. If you're West Toledo and you're Rogers or you're Bowser in the south end, those are parts of what used to be Adams Township. Our whole area is townships, and especially once you get outside the city limits of Toledo, almost everything is a township. Perrysburg Township, Lake Township, down by Otsego, you've got Grand Rapids Township and Washington Township. And these are all, self-governing 36 mile square, 6 by 6 areas that govern themselves. So this creation of townships was brand new. This was a brand new concept, and they started it in Ohio. If you look down here at the bottom, you see OHIO right there, and then you see this little part down here, down by today's like Athens, down by like OU, and it's along the Mississippi, along the Ohio River, where today's West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio get together, and they created this initial land of the Seven Ranges to basically see if this township structure would work. So they drew the first range line straight across east to west, then drop down north to south every 6 miles, creating another range line across. Now, from that, you kind of see over here, each one of these little squares is broken into 1 mile square sections. So there are 36 sections in every township, okay? Now, in there are reserved sections. Different sections were reserved for different things, all right? all of the sections could get sold off. The money went to the U.S. government, which again, under the Articles of Confederation, there's no taxes. So this is one of the only ways the U.S. government could make money. So every one of these reserve sections gets sold off for money. Now, in that section, here's all the sections, right? This is the 6 mile by 6 mile. Then the section itself is broken into subdivisions, okay? So a farmer could buy an area that was half mile by half mile, or quarter mile by half mile, or quarter mile by quarter mile, or these little eighth by eighth sections. Every one of these, the quarter sections and 16th sections, they could also be subdivided, and the person who bought it could make money by selling off, 50, 60 acres, whatever, to the next person. Now, the big deal here, though, was Section 16.
And that brings us back to the schoolhouse. We're just outside of Grand Rapids, Ohio. The Land Ordinance of 1785 divided all the new lands of America into a system of squares. You guys have all seen this if you've been out in the country, where all the roads are straight, they have 90-degree intersections exactly 1 mile apart. The Land Ordinance drew 1 mile squares across the rest of the country. Then each 6 mile wide by 6 mile deep square was organized into what was called a township. And townships became the basic form of government for the rest of the United States. If you've been around Toledo, you know about townships. Washington Township is Whitmer. Adams Township became the Rogers neighborhood. These were all created by the Land Ordinance of 1785. And townships became this foundation of local government that they still are to this day in most of the country. But they did one other really cool thing in the Land Ordinance. They created public education in the United States. Section 16 of every township, a 1 mile square, was reserved for education. Most of the land in that square was sold off to pay for education, but one small part of the square became the schoolhouse. What that meant was that the money paid for education in perpetuity, and the people of the township agreed that they were going to pay for public education to educate everybody's kids exactly the same. It's one of the foundational ideas of America that everybody, no matter where you were born, no matter who you were born to, deserves a free and equal public education.
So here's kind of a visualization of that about Section 16. All of the land in Section 16 is sold to fund the school. Then a part of Section 16 actually hosts the schoolhouse. So if you think about it, if you put the schoolhouse right here, down in the southwest corner of Section 16, it's going to be central for everybody in the township. Everyone in the township would have an equal distance to get to. If you were in the far corners in 131, 36, or 6, everybody could come and have an equal chance, equal distance to the schoolhouse that would be down here in this corner of Section 16. Now, around here, township schools became the primary focus. Adams Township schools existed until the 1960s. Rogers High School was not part of TPS until the 1960s. It was the Adams Township High School. Whitmer, to this day, is still the Washington Township High School. Those of you living out by Rogers who might have a longer memory have heard of Spencer Sharples, and that was the official high school. It's a complicated story, but it was kind of the official high school for Spencer Township as it used to exist. So township schools became kind of the primary way by which we organized public education at the K-12 level. Now, that law is passed. 2 years go by, and another ordinance is needed to deal with these lands. This is happening at the same time they're negotiating on the Constitution. They're trying to figure out what the Constitution is going to have in it, but they need to pass this other law. So there's really only 2 laws under the Articles of Confederation that we really care about. Land Ordinance of 1785, Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And the Northwest Ordinance, as you can see, deals with basically the Great Lakes states today. Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, parts of Minnesota. And the Northwest Ordinance establishes a process for allowing new states to join the United States. And it says a couple of important things. Number one, it says all of these states out here are going to be their own thing. They don't get to be the property of Pennsylvania or Virginia or anything. They get to be a new state with exactly the same rights as the existing states. And that's a pretty big deal. The other thing they do is set a process. And they said, okay, once there are 5,000 free males in an area, they can organize what we're going to call a territorial legislature. So the Ohio Territory, once there were 5,000 free white males in Ohio Territory, they could organize a territorial legislature and elect a territorial governor. The other thing it did that was a really big deal, this is one of our first anti-slavery laws in American history. It says there will be no slavery in any state created out of the territory. So there was never an argument in 1803 when Ohio became a state. There was never an argument whether it was going to be slave or free. And the same for the other states that were created out of this territory. So as you can imagine, as you look at the map, where is slavery going to be an issue? Missouri, Iowa. Those were going to have arguments about whether they should be slave or free when they reached their thresholds for statehood. The other thing it did, it said there will be at least one university of good quality established in the Northwest Territory. And the place they picked for it was in today's Athens, Ohio. And it was originally called like the University of the Northwest or something. And today it's OU. Oh yeah! The other thing about the Northwest Ordinance that is critical to understand, not everybody's a fan of this. So Native Americans understand very well that organizing this territory into private property that will be owned by these Europeans coming across the mountains, the Native Americans fully understand what this means for them. Okay? And this is going to lead to the large-scale conflicts that we're going to see between white settlers and Native Americans who had owned this land in the first place. And this is a situation that is only going to grow more grim and more dire for Native Americans in the coming years. 10 years after this, the situation will have become incredibly deadly, and Native Americans will have been forced, essentially at gunpoint and starvation, out of their ancestral lands. Why do we care about all this? Okay, well, there's a number of reasons to care about all this. Supporters of the Articles of Confederation, which are mostly southern states and states with a very small population, they're going to try to keep the Articles of Confederation going. They don't want people in Georgia, do not want people from Massachusetts telling them what to do. Okay, now Virginia is a little different. Virginia is a slave legal state, but Virginia has a large population, and so Virginia is going to oppose the Articles of Confederation. They want to get out of this deal. And then, as we're going to discuss in our next unit, there's going to be one major event that's going to come along where the national government is going to be exposed as being incredibly weak. And it's really going to convince a lot of people, or at least better than half of the people, that we need a stronger national government. The weakness of the Articles ends up being its undoing. Now, why else do we care? The Articles government, the government set up under the Articles, did accomplish a few really important precedents. And the Land Ordinance of 1785, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, those are still really important foundational documents for us to understand in today's America. I hope this video was somewhat useful to you. As always,
Guys, even with all of this, you're doing great.